Our next session is brought to you by one of our summit supporters, the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association, for a look at how connectivity is impacting energy innovation. So please welcome to the stage NRECA CEO Jim Matheson in conversation with Scott Peterson, the Senior Vice President of Communications.
Thank you, Jessica. It's great to join you all here this afternoon and understand you've had good conversations around broadband and digital divide, and we're going to continue around that theme a little bit this afternoon. Just want to give a further introduction of Jim, who's a 7-term member of Congress from Utah, now is the CEO at NRECA and also serves on the FCC Broadband Development Advisory Council. And on the Hill, Jim served on the Energy and Commerce Committee and was broadly known as somebody who could work across the aisle and bring desperate parties together, which is almost a vanishing breed on Capitol Hill today. So a really good background to talk about some of the issues we'll talk about today. We're very pleased to partner with Bloomberg at this event and to explore ideas that will help really connect and grow all of America, but obviously we have a passion for rural communities throughout the country, and so we'll address a lot of that. And as an association that's comprised of about 900 rural electric cooperatives, we're acutely aware of some of the challenges in rural communities today. But we also serve a lot of exurban areas around Washington, around Atlanta, and other large cities. So really cities where sprawl has grown into what were initially rural areas, and our electric cooperatives serve many of those around the country as well. So let's explore just the rural landscape for a few minutes, if we could, and talk about the need for broadband for some 23 million Americans who currently are either unserved or underserved today. So Jim, why does this e-connectivity gap persist despite a lot of widespread attention to this issue from the administration, from Republicans and Democrats alike on the Hill?
Sure. Some of the reasons are pretty clear. One is there aren't enough people, and with less population density, it's hard to make the economics work, and that's why you have a lot of areas where broadband has not been deployed. But another reason is the way federal policy is set up today, that hasn't worked either. And if we really want to talk about creating opportunity for everyone in America, including these 23 million people in rural America, to have access to real broadband, then we ought to talk about modifying federal policy to something that's going to work better. I mean, since 2001, the Universal Service Fund, through the FCC, spent $114 billion on rural telecom. And look at this, we still have these 23 million people without access to broadband. So I think it's a great time to have a conversation about how we can modify policy in a way that's going to make meaningful change and opportunities for rural America. It's important to us as electric co-ops because we're owned by the communities we serve. That's the cooperative business model. And these communities don't have much of a future if they're not going to have broadband. So this is a pretty high priority for us, and we want to be a constructive voice at the table in terms of talking how to make the policies work in a better way.
So because of that ownership model, cooperatives really are uniquely situated to understand the needs of their communities and serve them beyond providing reliable electricity to their homes and businesses. So how are electric cooperatives engaged in broadband and helping to close the digital divide?
Well, it's really interesting. First of all, in terms of how a modern electric utility functions today, you need broadband capacity within your utility infrastructure. The amount of data to really have smart meters and a smart grid component to your system, you've got to invest in fiber, at least through all your substations, to take advantage of that. And when it comes to electric cooperatives, we've really been leaders in that regard. In fact, we are well above the national average in terms of smart grid penetration, in terms of investment in that, what we call the fiber backbone of the electric grid system. So if we've already got that asset deployed, in terms of that fiber backbone, it's an interesting position to be in terms of leveraging that asset to also provide retail broadband to both homes and businesses. And we've got co-ops that are doing just that. I'll give you a quick example. Rawls County Electric Co-op in Missouri, who received both a loan and a grant through the stimulus program in 2009. They made investments in broadband. It was first for the smart grid application. They leveraged it into retail. They have a 70% take rate now across their service territory, which is pretty remarkable. And that's an example of where if you have the right loan grant combination, because it's going to take, as I said, in these sparsely populated areas, the economics don't pencil out on their own. That's why the for-profits haven't gone there. If you get the right combination of loan grant to make it work, electric co-ops have this interesting advantage of investment in the system backbone for the electric utility operation to also provide retail broadband.
So a lot of conversation on the Hill, a lot of conversation out in the States through some USDA programming on e-connectivity that the co-ops have been active in. What do policymakers need to be thinking about as they, maybe not in the lame duck session, but go into 2019 in terms of shaping policy around broadband?
It's a great question. I mentioned earlier our current policy hasn't worked, and there are a few reasons. One is we're working with bad data. If you can't even measure what you got, how do you fix it? And the way it works now in terms of determining areas that are underserved or unserved altogether, the way the FCC gets that data is the current incumbent providers self-report the data, and it's wildly inaccurate. Secondly, if we want to really talk about reaching those sparsely populated areas, it can't be a situation where you cherry pick the population centers and leave folks in the more sparsely populated areas out of the equation. And so you got to have, in my opinion, for federal policy, something that has a loan grant component to it based on population density. Lower population density areas, it's going to be more grant, less loan. Higher density, more loan, less grant. That's one way to take care of it. But the other aspects of this policy that we ought to be looking at are, let's make sure it's real broadband in terms of speed, and not just what we think is the right speed today, but in a forward-looking approach where we really think the speeds need to be. There's just too many places in rural America right now that are at 4.1 or 10.1, and that just doesn't cut it. Policy should also not necessarily favor any particular type of technology. We should talk about what the speed should be. And policy shouldn't favor any particular business model or provider. That's where, again, to toot the horn of the electric cooperatives, I think when we come to the table and meet with policymakers, we have a pretty pure agenda. We want consumers in rural areas to have real broadband. We don't care who offers it. It could be the co-op, it could be someone else, but we want our consumers to have it. Everybody else at the table has their own agenda, their own business model, protecting their own service territory. We try to approach this from truly through the eyes of the consumer. And I think those are the components of federal policy that could move this forward. And as you mentioned, we've got a pilot program through the Rural Utility Service at the Department of Agriculture that's going to do just that. They're going to do the loan grant combination. Congress funded it with $600 million, not enough to change all of rural America. This is an interesting opportunity to test this idea about a new way to look at federal policy to really make rural broadband happen.
So shift gears just a minute. You mentioned the historical nature of electric co-ops, going into communities and giving power to folks who'd never had it before. Sometimes 1, 2, 3 homes per mile makes it very expensive to bring that power and now broadband to those communities. But when electric co-ops were first formed 80 years ago, very small traditional type utilities had traditional generation sources for electricity. But today that profile is much different. Today, while they're smaller than investor-owned utilities, you have a lot of cooperatives that are innovating, partly because they're small enough to be nimble and really go to what their members are asking them for.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I got to admit, when I started as CEO of the Rural Electric Cooperative Association 2.5 years ago, I kind of had this perception of rural co-ops. They were kind of, conservative with a small c, kind of waiting for other people to take action first. But I've learned that's not true. And in fact, the level of innovation is impressive. I mentioned before, when it comes to smart meter penetration, the rural co-ops are way ahead of the rest of the utility sector in the United States. When it comes to looking for ideas that meet community needs, because as I said earlier, we're owned by the communities we serve. We're not responsive to shareholders on Wall Street. It's all cooperative ownership. And because we're owned by the communities we serve, different communities have different needs. So in Hawaii, it may be a solar array. And in Kodiak, Alaska, it may be a wind turbine. We've got co-ops doing fascinating, innovative activities. Vermont Electric is going to start up in 2019 a large lithium battery storage capacity that's going to save roughly $100,000 a year. And that may not sound like a lot of money, but for a co-op of that size, it actually is meaningful. We're leaning into the electric vehicle opportunity. We've got co-ops looking at ways to encourage electric vehicle adoption. Delaware Electric Co-op near here, they're offering free installation of in-home slow charging infrastructure. In Cobb Electric outside of Atlanta, they're offering a rate structure design where the first 400 kilowatts kilowatt hours per month. If you use it between midnight and 6 a.m., it's free. That's not just for charging vehicles. That could be if you're running your clothes dryer or your dishwasher, but it's an effort to think through what the consumer needs to create value. That's what's fascinating about co-ops right now. And as Scott mentioned in the question, because we're small, and sometimes small hurts you, sometimes small helps you. And we have a capacity to be innovative and quick and nimble and responsive to those consumer needs. That's what's going on when it comes to innovation with co-ops.
Thanks, Jim. A couple minutes left. I want to dive into what we might expect out of the next Congress. And we're a week removed from the midterms, and while it may be too early to handicap some changes that might happen next year, as a former member of Congress, what are the trends we should be looking for?
Well, are we all optimistic for a lot of legislative activity? Listen, I think that sometimes it's important to state the obvious. We're moving into divided government, where a different party controls each, one in the Senate, one in the House. And so if you're going to move legislation forward, it's got to be bipartisan. And we should seek out opportunities where that could take place. And if I were to take a stab at that, the first place I'd go is some type of infrastructure package. President Trump first talked about infrastructure when he was candidate Trump. I think he really is committed to it. It's traditionally been an issue that folks on both sides of the aisle have supported, and it's traditionally not taken on too much of an ideological bent. Of course, from our perspective with the electric co-ops, we want to make sure that infrastructure is defined in a way that is expansive. While roads and bridges are important, we think the notion of investment in the electric grid and resiliency is an important thing to talk about, and smart grid capability. I think broadband needs to be part of the infrastructure investment opportunity as well. So I think that's one area where the Congress could really make some progress in a bipartisan way. But what I keep an eye on is this. Each Congress takes on its own personality. And while the margin isn't exactly set, because there are a few elections that are still yet to be called, it's a relatively small majority right now in the House. It's going to be interesting to see if a group of more moderate Democrats is able to really step into a role of playing that the convener, if you will, and creating opportunities for a bipartisan conversation between the two parties. That's my hope. That was my politics, so I guess I'm a little biased on this. But that's something I think we should keep an eye on as we look at the next Congress.
The Farm Bill, obviously important to a lot of constituents that we serve across rural America. Could happen in the lame duck, could move into next year. What do you see coming out of the Farm Bill that would be important for rural cooperatives and the timing of that?
Sure. We'd love to see the Farm Bill done in this lame duck. Lame duck sessions always are very difficult to predict in terms of where they go or don't go. So I don't know if it's going to move in this session or not. For those of you who may not follow the Farm Bill process, both the House and the Senate have passed their own versions of the Farm Bill. They've created a conference committee. There are some issues of disagreement right now between those two bills, and so there's some effort that will have to take place for those differences to be resolved. But the principals in the House and the Senate involved in it say they're working toward that goal. There are some important issues in it relative to electric cooperatives. There's a significant commitment to broadband and some interesting language, particularly in the House bill, that we find very favorable. There's a commitment to a significant and robust support of rural economic development measures, which really matters in terms of us representing our communities. I've said it now for the third time, we are owned by the communities we serve. And so we're very interested in making sure investment in those communities takes place so they have an opportunity to thrive. So those are some Farm Bill issues that matter to us. And as far as we're concerned, we're going to advocate for moving that bill as fast as we can in this lame duck. And if it doesn't move in the lame duck, then we start up again in January and the process begins anew. But I think it's important for the future of rural America that we make investments in rural America. It's interesting. We serve like 1 in 8 people in America. Rural electric co-ops do. And yet that co-op territory serves areas that produce 70% of all the agricultural output in America and 30% of all the manufacturing output in America. So these communities are an important part of our economy in a disproportionate way to the populations we even serve. And that's why I think having a robust Farm Bill that supports rural America makes a lot of sense.
Great. Jim, thank you so much for your perspective on those and other issues. Again, want to thank Bloomberg for the partnership of joining you today, and look forward to hearing more as we talk about the issues of really bringing technology and bringing it to rural America. So thank you very much.
Okay, thanks.